Good morning.
First of all, I want to acknowledge all the work that goes into a Sunday service. This bulletin presents this nice, neat package, but if there's anything I learned this week, it's that things run smoothly because of the work of many talented people. The musicians, readers, slides and sound, worship support. It's a family working together, and thank you. The Isaiah passage that was just read invokes some powerful imagery, subduing nations, leveling mountains, breaking down doors. Sometimes our problems feel so fixed, the wounds cut so deep, and sometimes it feels very isolating. We put on this armor of well-being, even when we're crumbling inside. But God knows us, even when we turn away. God offers a balm of love, greater than any of the hurts that we both inflict and incur. But going back to the gospel reading that we read earlier, the Pharisees had this very straightforward problem. Pretty manageable, certainly nothing that seemed insurmountable. Should you pay tax to Caesar? Except it's a question that had no safe answer. Kind of like when your spouse and your mom both bring an apple pie and you have to pick which slice are you going to have. Well, you better have one of each, and well, you better make sure they're equal because, well, you know they're measuring. But the stakes, well, they were a lot higher for Jesus, and he knew it. And he called them out. You hypocrites. You act nice on the surface, but really you're just trying to get me into a trap. If he answered yes, pay your taxes, well, he would have appeared to be supporting the Roman oppression of Jews. On the other hand, if he answered, no, don't pay taxes, well, then he's this revolutionist. So Jesus, in a very typical fashion, answered the Pharisees on a totally different level, turning the concept of wealth and power upside down. Give to Caesar what is his. Give him that hunk of metal that the world is so desperate for. Jesus had a deeper understanding of the value of that denarius than even the shrewdest Roman tax collector. And as you might have picked up, I find currencies kind of fascinating. I mean, really, how interesting that the Transnistrian ruble, which is worth nothing anywhere else, can be so important to someone that it's illegal to go in with the euro or some other currency. Currencies really are about nation building, identity. This is who we are, and more often the case, this is who we aren't. We're not those guys. We're not you. Oh, and we're definitely not those. The Roman denarius was Caesar's claim on his empire. And 2,000 years later, we as Canadians aren't all that different. I seem to remember some great public debates on which figureheads should we put on our bills. And I mean, how insulting is it to go down to the States and try and get a can of pop and that your Canadian quarter gets rejected out of the machine? I mean, how does it know? But God doesn't recognize state boundaries. There is but one kingdom of heaven, and we are all part of it. Those Americans, those Canadians, those Moldovians, even those Transnistrians. Money, like state borders, divide us as people. Those who have it, those who don't. And God wants no part of anything that separates one of us from another. Kim and I have some really close friends that have this incredibly successful business, and they're kind and progressive and generous, wonderful people. And they have 3 children, and they just form this picture-perfect family. And 2 years ago, their youngest and their only daughter graduated from high school. And the very next day, she collapsed in their home. Her heart had given out from severe anorexia. They rushed her to the hospital, they revived her, but still, 2 years later, she's still hospitalized. The disease is still unmanageable. And this family has every possible resource. They've gone to the States to seek private treatment. They're able to take time off work so one of them can sit by her bedside day in and day out. Yet no amount of money has been able to heal their daughter. And so I wonder, what has this family learned about the value of money? And I'm anything but an economist, but we do have a small business, and I get the general idea of what we call profit and loss. You have the sales price, you have your cost price. There's my little formula. And if there's anything left over, well, you have your profits. And in the cost price, you have your materials, your labor, licensing, shipping, all those other business costs. Now, from the capitalist mindset, you want to keep that cost price down to the lowest possible amount so you have more profits. This is the formula of our modern day understanding of money. And household budgets actually work much the same way. You have your income, less all your expenses, and if anything is left at the end of the month, well, lucky you, you've got a profit. But again, there's this innate race to the bottom approach built into this understanding. Families, like businesses, want to keep their expenses low to have that remainder at the end of the month. So we shop specials, we look for deals, and try to save costs wherever possible. Families, businesses, not a whole lot different. So we end up with this shirt from Walmart that costs $4.99. And I promise you, always, Walmart is still taking a profit there. But how is that possible with that formula? I mean, you can barely get a cup of coffee in Kelowna for $5, but you can grab a shirt from China? Something's missing. Some costs are not being paid, not being accounted for. Or, well, actually, they're just not being paid by us. That shirt in Walmart is a deal because our society has placed more value onto paper currency than onto human life. Children, women, men are exploited so that we can have cheap clothing, cheap food, and cheap stuff. If we factored in fair compensation for that shirt, we'd have a price tag higher than $4.99. But what happens to the family budget then? In our current economic structure, something has to give. And it's never going to be Walmart. It's always going to be the most vulnerable and the most marginalized that pay. Know the value of your purchases. Know the costs involved, not just the price tag. We complain about the cost of fuel as we gas up our cars, the sunshine tax. Yet, know that Mother Earth is still subsidizing our ride. By ignoring and denying these human and environmental costs, it's actually ourselves that we're hurting. One of my favorite books is The Glass Castle by Jeanette Walls. Some of you might have read it. It's a common book. And there's a movie out now. And in the opening scene of the movie, Jeanette, it's her life story. And she's being driven home after having a fancy dinner at a restaurant. And she spots her parents digging in the dumpster. Now, Jeanette is holding a takeaway box from the restaurant filled with the beautiful meal that was too much for her to eat. But she doesn't stop to acknowledge her folks. In fact, she does the opposite. She turns her head and she looks away. And the scene hits very hard for me. My folks were never, ever well off. If there was a bad financial decision to make, they made it. Especially when I was moving out at that time, they went through a particularly hard times. They had lost their house in Salmon Arm, and they were renting a trailer beside the golf course. At this time, I was working at the Safeway, and like Jeanette Walls, trying to distance myself from that life, trying to forge a new life. My parents, they had no money. For a little bit of extra cash, my dad would walk the golf course looking for stray balls. He would then try to peddle those balls to the passing golfers. More than once, he was kicked off the course. Many of these golfers were my coworkers at Safeway, and I was absolutely mortified that my dad was doing this. And one day, one of those coworkers came up to me and said, "Hey, the guy that walks the golf course selling balls, isn't that your dad?" And I immediately, flat out, denied my dad. I have a pretty good idea of how Peter felt. Society frowns on people like my dad. They're public nuisances. I mean, really, who wants to be confronted by someone selling golf balls when you're setting up to tee? Who wants to be harassed for spare change when you're having your patio lunch on Bernard Avenue? Who wants to think about the small hands that toiled over that shirt, receiving next to nothing in pay? That panhandler, though, is someone's father, mother, child, sister, brother, friend. Someone just trying to get by in a world that plays favorites. That day at work, as I adamantly refused knowing the man on the golf course, I was the one that paid the price for denying my father. My dad was no less a man. He was trying to find a way to provide for his family. He just didn't fit neatly into that formula over what's an acceptable form of income. I, on the other hand, I was diminished. And 20 years later, I still feel the weight of not acknowledging my father, valuing the surface coating of money rather than the depth of humanity. So when you ignore the marginalized, when you ignore those hidden costs of exploiting our planet and its people, it's your own spirit that ultimately pays the price. Jesus, he understood money. Yes, there was and there still remains a Caesar. There are taxes and mortgages and grocery bills to pay. Jesus got that. But Caesar doesn't own your conscience, doesn't own your kindness, your generosity, your ethics. Caesar has no claim on your soul. And those are all the things that fall outside of the world's profit formula. Embrace them, live them, hold those values up. Those gifts, the ones outside of the denarius, those give to God. And let's make no mistake, money can be used for good purposes. I watched this church take a tiny little budget and do great things. Refugees have been sponsored, scholarships have been awarded, lives have been transformed. But there is a dark side to money. How many families have squabbled over an inheritance? Something that was given as a gift ends up causing strife. How many marriages have been torn apart by finances? And ironically, it's not usually because of the lack of finances. It's about competing relationships and attitudes towards money. How many friendships have been lost? Money is lent to a buddy and never quite returned. 10 years of friendship gone over $200. How many people have been stepped on and over in pursuit of that almighty dollar? We have an economy where prosperity is based on how much you can squeeze out of people. How many minerals and resources can you strip from the soil? And that system has no place in the kingdom of God. God doesn't want any part of that formula. In fact, God stands at the edges and reaches for those left out. And we're called to take our head out of the sand and understand money and its worth. Understand why a t-shirt can be sold for $4.99, and yet a family with a daughter and an abundance of wealth still has that daughter suffering from anorexia. Money has both implications and it has its limitations. And what is your relationship with money? Know the significance of your decisions. Are you hurting with your choices, or are you helping? Are you putting too much significance on a resource that can disappear overnight? Isaiah's big, beautiful words can seem like intangible concepts when we're weighted down with an economic system that's all-consuming. I mean, really, how can we go up against the capitalist structure of the world? This power that Isaiah speaks about, well, it's just not going to fly in today's world. We're too far gone, too lost. But that's the easy answer out. When the hurts of the world seem overwhelming, it's easy to tune out, shake our heads, and go on with our lives. It's easy to drive by and not acknowledge the person in the dumpster. But God is still summoning us, calling us out by name. We might not be able to fix that profit formula, but we can fix and work on our own relationships, both with money and with each other. We are called to bear witness to those hidden costs, to give face to the marginalized, and to acknowledge the value of each and every one of us. All those good things, all of our true worth, everything that we can offer and produce, give those to God.